Please be seated. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It wouldn't be a March Sunday morning without a little bit of snow, right? A couple pre-reflections. This is very Jewish. Before you ever get into your reflections, you have to have some pre-reflections, though, first. Then, driving from St. Louis Park down 394 this morning, noticing how clear the highway already was at 7 o'clock this morning. Never want to be late for my dear friend, the Reverend Tim Kingsley. Just made me thankful for all the people that worked so hard throughout the night, early morning, plowing the highways to make sure we had an opportunity to drive safely, taking time from their families, probably called into work because that's the nature of the job, is to respond to meteorological issues for our highways. So I'm thankful for all the people that do such important work to keep us all safe on the roads. I'm Steve Hunegs. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, here with my colleagues Laura Zell and Susie Greenberg, and we feel very welcomed here. Thank you. Thank you for honoring us. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to preach. I've never been called the preacher before, so this is a first. And thank you for hosting Transfer of Memory. My dear friend, Stephen Belton, who's the president and CEO of the Urban League Twin Cities, he's a true preacher. Now, that's someone you have to hear. I'm going to call him and say, I've now been called the preacher. Okay, there you have it. And to see some very dear friends like Bill Carpenter or Paul Thatcher here today, it's really a delight and a pleasure. I think we need a little bit of hope to start the day. When I was reading through the website, I came upon a piece by Bishop Loya. And in his piece, he was affirming the importance of the Sabbath. Shabbat is a time of contemplation, reflection, decompression. Couldn't agree more with him, particularly in these days in which we live. A famous Jewish writer from the beginning of the 20th century, Ahad Ha'am, said it this way. He said, more than the Jews that have kept the Sabbath has kept the Jews. And there's a deep eternal truth for all of us, not just those who are Jewish. And as we round the corner to the temporal connection this year between Ramadan, Passover, and Easter, let's all keep that in mind. Another expression of hope in these days. Agnes Dunn was the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, D.C. It became his solemn duty to preside over the funeral of Franklin Roosevelt in the East Room of the White House in April of 1945. And he chose for the nation to remember what President Roosevelt said at his first inaugural, and that was most famously, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And then Bishop Dunn continued, as that was his first word to us, I'm sure he'd want it to be his last. We shall go forward without fear of the future, without fear of our allies or of our friends, and without fear for our own insufficiency. And given the challenges that we face locally, nationally, globally, to take the bishop's words, remembering President Roosevelt, I hope provides us some strength that we can overcome the difficulties of the time, perhaps not perfectly, but with great resolution. So it also parallels teaching from the Talmud, which is the commentary on the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. And it says, the world is sustained by 3 things: justice, peace, and justice, peace, and I can't read my own writing all of a sudden. Truth, of course. Truth, emet, peace, shalom, justice, dayan. So we keep in mind these things. I want to say some thank yous here, of course, to the congregation, to the very Reverend Paul Labens, England, of course, your Reverend and Dean of the Cathedral. Take a moment of personal privilege to talk about a second, Reverend Canon Timothy Kingsley, Tim, who has been so close and has done so much work with the JCRC over the years in security matters in other ways, and so proud of Tim as he went through the process of becoming a priest, an ordination, and becoming a leader of this congregation and the community in general. Thank you, Tim, and thank you for the invitation. The Reverend Mary Beth Farrell, canon developer Mary Lusk, Christine Slager of Sages, and the entire staff and cathedral and ministry team here. In this beautiful nave, where we're surrounded by such glorious renditions of history and religion and Christianity, I, of course, appreciate the deep historical connection of St. Mark's and then St. Mark's Cathedral to the state of Minnesota and well beyond. Learning from Tim this morning when I saw what's on the ground, that the Anglican Communion was held here in 1954. But indeed, this connection, this congregation goes back to 1858, the year of Minnesota's statehood. Sort of in a beshert way, which is the Hebrew word for fated, I learned that the cathedral has a relationship with the Coventry Cathedral, Coventry, England. I had the privilege of studying for a year at the University of Warwick, 1983, 1984, which is located just outside of Coventry. Saw many times the devastation of World War II with respect to the Coventry Cathedral, but also the reconciliation, as so much of the cathedral is dedicated to reconciliation between Britain and Germany. And then the very year, 1941, when the church became a cathedral, of course, an epochal year, 1941, your neighbors down the street, our dear friends at Temple Israel, if you go into Temple Israel, you'll see that the very first Minnesotan who died in the Second World War at Pearl Harbor was a congregant at Temple Israel, Ensign Ira Wheel Jeffrey, and you can see a memorial to his life. Atlantic Charter, signed August in 1941. Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, aboard the cruiser, the USS Augusta. What were they asserting but the importance of collective security? The importance that in the face of aggression by the Axis, resolute and determined coordinated action was necessary. But also a vision for the post-war world, which seemed a long ways away in 1941, even before the United States' entry into the war. No more territorial aggrandizement, restoration of self-government, global cooperation for better economic and social conditions. Indeed, the strength of nations can resist aggression, but our spirit and our faith are also critical to the task. The lectionary for today, Deuteronomy 26, 114, as we heard the reading. I'll hold up a book. It's a book of Torah commentary, that is Eitz Chaim, which is the expression of the Rabbinical Assembly, the collection, the gathering of the rabbis in the conservative movement in Judaism. And the name itself, Eitz Chaim, is highly symbolic. It means tree of life. It's the continuity, similarities between traditions with essentially parading of the book here today in church. We do the same thing with the Torah, tree of life, and we sing when the Torah is brought out. The Torah is a tree of life to those who cleave to it or those who cling to it. You know, today's reading is actually what we call the Parshat Kitavo. And keep in mind that throughout the world, on the Sabbath and earlier in the week, Jews are reading the same Torah portion. And you can read it over the course of a year. Kitavo actually means sort of when you enter the land. The first two words are taken, the title of the Parshat, the Torah portion, is taken from the first two words of the portion itself. And we've already read that we're talking about farmers bringing the first fruit to the temple, which of course was a highly important moment for a temple-based religion such as Judaism was before the destruction of the Second Temple in 70. And they talk about the declaration before God. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm, and an awesome arm. It's a little bit of a variation on a theme, because we often see in the Torah, in the Bible, love your neighbor as thyself, for you were a slave in the land of Egypt. This is the most oft-repeated commandment, admonition, mitzvah in the Torah, 36 times. 36 times. That's remarkable. 36 different times. Well, the first piece of it is, of course, we're commanded to remember what it is that happened. Seder's coming up for Passover, and of course we'll recount all that happened, the enslavement, the Exodus, and what would come to follow. So remembering is critically important in and of itself. But we remember for a purpose, and that is to work towards a better present with the inspiration of the past towards an even greater future, collectively, as a people, all peoples. Similarly, the role of humanity in history is reflected in Psalm 91. The psalmist identifies the struggles and the dangers of life: pestilence, war, plague, falsehood, terror. There is the divine, but it aligns with the agency of women and men. What does Psalm 91, line 15 say? He shall call upon me, and I will answer him. He shall call upon me, and I will answer him. In other words, I will do my duty. I will do my best to answer God and to help in the mission. Story of God reaching out to Abraham right at the beginning of Genesis. And what does Abraham say? Hineni, here I am. And in a way, we live in a moment when all of us, hopefully, in their own way, will answer, Hineni, here I am, God, to help with the struggles and the opportunities that we face in life. And we know those dangers that we face at home and abroad. Dangers to democracy, decency, and dignity. The words of Winston Churchill, the co-signatory of the Atlantic Charter, he says, "Arise and take our stand for freedom, as in the olden time." Or in the words of Dr. Ralph Bunche, who was the first African-American Nobel laureate who won his Nobel Prize for negotiating the armistice between Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria at the conclusion of Israel's War of Independence in 1948, he says, "To make our way, we must have firm resolve, persistence, and tenacity." And indeed, I know this congregation, I know its spirit. We will all be able to exhibit such things to help our community go forward. Little piece now about the Transfer of Memory exhibit. I look down and I see Laura and Susie, and who are co-curators of the exhibit, and afterwards they'll be pleased to talk to you about the exhibit and the wonderful people that are photographed in the stories. And I'm very proud to say it's been exhibited 60, 70 different places, 5 different states, colleges, universities, historical societies, the airport during the Super Bowl. So it's had a lot of currency over time. Apparently on Thursday, if I'm getting this right, you'll have a chance to meet the photographer, David Sherman, right here at St. Mark's, as well as, maybe you won't get to meet her, but Lily Chester is a writer and a wonderful person, little vignettes that accompany the pictures. I want to say this piece right at the beginning. Teaching of Salo Baron, who held more or less the first chair in Jewish studies, Jewish history, at Columbia University, and he said, avoid the temptation to take the lachrymose view of Jewish history, that somehow Jewish history is the sum total or the culmination of massacres, pogroms, and expulsions leading to the Holocaust. Well, that's a wrinkle, a feature of Jewish history. But the greater part of the story is, of course, Jewish contributions to culture, history, theology, science, you name it, in conjunction with peoples from throughout time, throughout the world. So please keep that in mind. I sort of connect to that piece in the Psalm 91, fearlessness. We must be fearless in what we do in life. And you'll see these stories, the stories of the people who survived, how they survived, and then the contributions they've made, continue to make to Minnesota. Just brought a couple things. For instance, Jack and Rochelle Sutton. You'll see their pictures. Well, Jack and Rochelle both were able to escape from their ghettos, ended up as partisan fighters in the Polish forests, met each other, fell in love, got married, fought the Nazis. Unbelievable stories of courage and survival. They had a daughter named C, who was born in a Munich displaced persons camp in Germany, of course. C ended up marrying my cousin, Steve, so she's all part of the family. But the stories that you'll see, the artist Judy Barron and the late Fred Barron, her husband, they sort of trace the arc of Central European Jewish civilization, Judy being from Hungary, Fred being from Vienna. Judy, an artist, likes to paint the pictures in watercolor of Roman Vishniak. Roman Vishniak was a photographer, Jewish photographer, who traveled throughout Central and Eastern Europe in the 1930s, taking pictures. He had a foreboding that perhaps something terrible was going to happen to the Jewish communities of Europe. Judy likes to paint the pictures of children, the pictures of the photographs of children that he took. Now, you can see many of these pictures at the Fagan Fighters World War II Museum in Granite Falls, Minnesota, where Ron and Diane Fagan very generously created an exhibit with her pictures, her story, a voiceover, and it's really something to see. And you can see the pictures of Judy and Fred Barron. Fred, for his part, loved to talk to schools. I remember going with him to South St. Paul High School, and for 2 hours, 2 different one-hour classes, he stood up, talked about his experience in the Shoah, the Hebrew word for Holocaust, never once sitting down for a second. He was probably 87, 88 years old at the time, and he was always challenging the kids. He'd say to the kids, "Who's prejudiced here?" And the kids would say, "No, none of us are prejudiced here." He said, "Of course you're prejudiced, but it's how you deal with your prejudice, which is the way that you live life." And then he'd explain to people how important love and reconciliation was, despite the fact that he'd seen some of the worst examples and characteristics of humanity that everyone could ever imagine. You know, the point being that the stories that you're going to read and the pictures that you're going to see, they tell really a story of hope, certainly tell a story of history and difficult history, but more importantly, a story of hope. I want to conclude by mentioning a couple things. Justice, Diane, what I mentioned before. 75th anniversary of the first Nuremberg war crimes trial, or more formally known as the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. It's also the 60th anniversary of the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, which did so much also to educate the world about the atrocities. Remember I said Saul Baron, he was actually the first witness in the Eichmann trial, and Israel's Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion wanted Baron as the first witness, not to discuss the war crimes of Eichmann presiding over the final solution, but David Ben-Gurion wanted the world to know, through Salom Baron's history, the world that was somewhat significantly destroyed, the Jewish world of civilization from Europe by the Nazis. So he was the very first witness in the trial. But all things are local, too, and going back to Nuremberg, a wonderful man named Larry Tillemans, who was from southwestern Minnesota, and he found himself literally as a typist working for the United States prosecution team, a man from Minneapolis, Minnesota, who was an Eagle Scout. And a documentary was made about his life because he, at a certain point in his life, after he was struggling with his alcoholism and woke up in jail one day, decided he had to make more of his life. And he decided what he was going to do was travel and tell people what he witnessed as this person who participated in the Nuremberg war crime trial about Holocaust revision and denial of Holocaust. He made that his life's mission. So when you look at all those pictures, remember too, people like Larry Tillemans, our military in the United States in the Second World War, all the Allied forces, which made it possible to celebrate our freedoms as we do today, worshiping and thinking and speaking here at St. Mark's and viewing this Transfer of Memory exhibit, because in a way, those veterans brought us to this day. So I thank everybody. Thank you to the choir for all the beautiful music, and for all the officiants and the clergy and all of you for strongly supporting this important institution, St. Mark's and the Episcopal Church. And it's our great pleasure to do this work for Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. We call it 225,000 square miles of paradise between the 3 states. So really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you very much. And again, a blessed Lenten season and a blessed Easter to everyone. Thank you.